The evening had settled over London like a thick, suffocating veil, the gas lamps flickering weakly through the persistent fog that clung to the narrow streets. Inside the cramped back room of his modest tailor's shop, Elias sat hunched over a battered wooden chair, the dim glow of a single candle casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. His eyes, bloodshot and weary, were fixed on the heavy garment folded in his lap, his own grief garment worn since the day Martha, his beloved sister, had passed from this world. The fabric was worn, its black silk dulled not only by time, but by the relentless weight of sorrow it represented. Where once the embroidery had shimmered with delicate threads, now it frayed, the seams stretched taut as if straining against the very body it cloaked. Elias traced the edges with a trembling finger, feeling the rough texture that had become a second skin, a prison woven from loss and tradition. He remembered the day he had first crafted that garment for Martha, a simple mourning ribbon, black as a raven's wing, tied gently around her wrist. Her smile had been soft, fragile, yet determined, a quiet defiance against the crushing demands of society. She had whispered to him then, "Make it light, Elias, for grief must not weigh so heavily on the soul." But the world had not listened. The city demanded its display of sorrow, each thread a testament to loss, each fold a public confession etched in cloth. And so Elias had worn his grief openly, a banner of mourning stitched tight around his chest. Yet tonight, in the solitude of shadows and silence, that garment felt less like a symbol and more like a chain, binding him to a past he longed to escape. His fingers, calloused yet gentle, began to work at the seams, loosening the tight stitches that held the fabric close. The task was painstaking, each pull threatening to unravel more than just thread. He hesitated, heart pounding, as if afraid that loosening the garment might release not only the cloth, but the sorrow itself. Outside, the muffled sounds of the city persisted, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the distant murmur of voices, the occasional bark of a street vendor hawking his wares. Yet inside, time seemed suspended, caught between the past and the possibility of change. Elias thought of the countless clients he had served, their faces etched with pain beneath layers of constricting cloth. He had seen the way their shoulders sagged under the weight of expectation, how their movements were stifled, how their grief became a spectacle. And now, in this quiet moment, he felt the burden of his own sorrow pressing down with equal force. A faint sound stirred him from his reverie, a whisper on the breeze, a memory of Martha's voice urging him onward. Light, she had said, not the heavy cloak of despair. With renewed determination, Elias worked through the night, carefully removing the restrictive linings, replacing heavy fabrics with lighter ones, and creating openings where there had been none. Each alteration was an act of rebellion, a stitch of hope sewn into the tapestry of grief. By dawn, the garment hung loosely from his frame, a shadow of its former weight. Elias stood before a cracked mirror, the first rays of morning filtering through the grimy window panes. He peeled the remnants of the grief garment from his shoulders, feeling the cold air kiss his skin for the first time in years. The liberation was intoxicating yet terrifying. To be seen without the mask of mourning was to expose the rawness beneath. He knew the risks. To unwear grief was to challenge not only social custom but the very fabric of Victorian society's control over emotion. The mourning police were relentless, and betrayal lurked in every shadow. Yet Elias's heart beat with a fierce hope that this act of personal defiance could kindle a flame for others burdened by their own sorrow. The day ahead promised uncertainty, danger, but also the possibility of transformation. Elias folded the altered garment with care and hid it beneath the floorboards of his shop, a secret testament to his resolve. In the stillness before the city awoke, he whispered a vow to the memory of Martha and to all those who suffered in silence. He would weave a new path through the threads of sorrow, one where grief was felt, honored, but no longer worn as a chain. And so, beneath the heavy fog and the watchful eyes of London, Elias prepared to step into the light of a future unbound by the fading embroidery of enforced mourning. The chill of the London evening clung to my bones as I slipped through the labyrinthine alleys of Whitechapel, the gas lamps casting eerie halos in the fog that curled like spectral fingers around the cobblestones. Tonight was no ordinary night. Beneath the surface of this somber city, a secret was stirring. One that promised to unravel the heavy threads binding us to sorrow, that heavy mantle we were forced to wear as if grief were a garment stitched onto our very skin. I descended the narrow iron staircase hidden behind a false wall in an abandoned warehouse. The scent of damp wood mingled with the faint aroma of beeswax candles, and the sharp tang of leather filled the air. Whispered voices echoed softly as I reached the chamber below, a cavernous room crowded with figures cloaked in varying shades of morning black. The flicker of lantern light danced across their faces, each etched with lines of pain and defiance. Mara was the first to greet me, her ash-colored hair pulled back tightly, the intricate patchwork cloak she wore embroidered with faded mourning symbols that told stories of loss and rebellion alike. She held out a delicate mourning veil, its black lace woven with hidden pockets, shimmering faintly under the candlelight. "This," she whispered, "conceals the sorrow without inviting prying eyes. A shield for the soul." I traced the intricate patterns with my fingers, marveling at the craftsmanship, each stitch a silent act of defiance. Around the room the murmurs grew louder as Jonah, a broad-shouldered man with a face weathered by soot and sorrow, recounted his narrow escape from the morning police. His voice was low but urgent, each word weighted with the memory of close calls and the relentless pressure of the law. "They tighten their grip every day," he warned, "but we grow in numbers and in spirit. The city's shadows are ours now." Silas, the quiet craftsman at my side, adjusted his spectacles and produced a small, intricate clasp designed to silently release the oppressive heaviness of a grief garment. We tested it carefully, the mechanism clicking softly in the hush of the room. The flickering candlelight illuminated our determined faces, a small beacon of hope against the encroaching darkness. As the night deepened, stories flowed like threads weaving a tapestry of resistance. Each person shared their own tale of loss and the suffocating weight of societal expectations. Yet beneath the sorrow was a fierce resolve to reclaim grief as a private emotion, not a public shackle. My heart swelled with a mixture of hope and fear. Here, in this hidden market, I found kindred spirits who dared to dream of freedom from the gilded cage of mourning. But with every new ally, the risk of discovery grew. The mourning police were ever vigilant, their presence an ominous shadow over our burgeoning movement. Still, I resolved to carry on. For every stitch I unraveled, for every seam I loosened, we edged closer to a future where grief could be felt deeply yet worn lightly, if at all. The night's whispers faded as I ascended the staircase back into the fog, the city's sorrow pressing down once more, but now, beneath that weight, a spark of rebellion glowed fiercely within me. This clandestine gathering was but a single thread in a vast tapestry. But together we would weave a new pattern, one where mourning was no longer a garment forced upon the living, but a journey embraced on our own terms. And so the market of shadows thrived, a beacon of defiance in a city cloaked in grief, where each stolen moment and whispered secret wove the promise of liberation. Yet, as the first light of dawn crept over the Thames, a chilling thought settled in my mind: how long before the morning police would unravel our carefully stitched rebellion? And when that day came, would we stand united or be torn apart like fragile fabric caught in a storm? The answer lay in the strength of our bonds, and the courage to keep sowing hope into the darkest corners of Victorian London. The dusk settled over the city like a shroud, thick fog curling through the narrow alleys and choking the gaslights into pale halos. Inside the cramped workshop hidden beneath a ramshackle facade, Elias worked feverishly, the needle threading through fabric as his apprentices moved about quietly, the atmosphere taut with the urgency of secrecy. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wool and the faint metallic tang of pins and needles. A single candle flickered on the worn workbench, casting dancing shadows against the brick walls lined with bolts of mourning cloth. Mara lingered near the back, her hands trembling as she folded a half-finished garment. Her eyes flickered toward Elias, who bent over a complex alteration designed to ease the crushing pressure of a widow's grief cloak. She had learned much under his tutelage, becoming a deft seamstress and a trusted confidant. Yet beneath her calm exterior churned a storm of doubt and fear for herself, for the fragile network they had built, and for the consequences of their defiance. After weeks of weighing her conscience against the tightening noose of the morning police's pursuit, Mara had made a choice. Slipping quietly from the workshop's back door, she vanished into the misty streets, her silhouette swallowed by the night. The path she took was measured and deliberate, each footfall muffled by the wet cobblestones as she made her way through a labyrinth of shadowed alleys to the station where Sergeant Harrow awaited her report. The next morning broke cold and gray, the city still cloaked in a somber veil of fog. Within moments, the tranquility shattered, heavy boots pounded against wooden stairs. Lanterns bobbed like will-o'-the-wisps through the gloom. The morning police, clad in their dark uniforms, surged into the hidden workshop with brutal efficiency. Shouts of command and cries of alarm echoed off the brick walls, drowning the muffled protests of apprentices as they scrambled to conceal their illicit work. Elias stood amidst the chaos, the weight of betrayal crashing down upon him like a tempest. He caught Mara's eye for a fleeting moment as she stood with the officers, her face pale but resolute. The sting of treachery seared through him, compounded by the sight of his comrades shackled, clutching fragments of altered garments that symbolized their hope and resistance. Without hesitation, Elias ducked behind a heavy curtain, slipping through a narrow passage he had long kept for emergencies. His breath came in ragged gasps as he navigated the maze of tunnels beneath the city, the distant shouts and clanging of chains a grim soundtrack to his flight. Each step was a desperate gamble, every shadow a potential snare. The cold night air bit at his skin when he finally emerged into an alley, the first rays of dawn casting a pale light over the ruined remnants of his sanctuary. Kneeling among scattered scraps of fabric and shattered tools, Elias felt the crushing weight of loss settle over him. The workshop, once a beacon of defiance against the suffocating norms of grief, was reduced to ashes and ruin. Yet amid the wreckage, a fierce flame kindled within his heart. The betrayal had exposed the fragility of trust, but it had not extinguished his resolve. He would rebuild. He must, for in the seams of shattered loyalty lay the threads of a new resistance, one tempered by caution but fueled by an unyielding desire to free the city from the gilded cage of mourning. The morning police might hunt him relentlessly, but Elias was no longer just a tailor, he was the shadow in the fabric of Victorian sorrow, stitching rebellion one clandestine thread at a time. As the city stirred awake, unaware of the tempest raging beneath its cobbled streets, Elias disappeared into the mist, a fugitive bound by grief and rebellion. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but his needle was steady and his cause more urgent than ever. The days that followed were a blur of whispered meetings and hidden safe-houses. Elias moved like a ghost through the city, gathering what remained of his loyal apprentices and forging alliances anew. Trust, once broken, was painstakingly rebuilt with cautious glances and veiled words. Each garment he crafted now bore not only the weight of sorrow, but the resilience of hope. Yet the shadow of Mara's betrayal lingered, a reminder that in a world where grief was law, rebellion came at a cost beyond the physical. Elias wrestled with the bitter knowledge that even those closest to him could falter under pressure, their loyalties torn between survival and solidarity. Despite the setbacks, whispers of his defiance spread through the underbelly of Victorian London. Those who had glimpsed the comfort of his altered grief garments sought him out in secret, their faces etched with longing for liberation. The morning police intensified their efforts, but Elias's network, though wounded, endured. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the window panes of a hidden room, Elias sat alone, tracing the delicate stitches on a newly fashioned garment. The fabric was lighter now, the seams more forgiving. It was a small victory against the unyielding oppression of ceremonial sorrow. His thoughts drifted to Mara, to the choices that had led to this fracture. Could forgiveness find a place in the heart of a man who bore the scars of betrayal? Or was the fabric of trust forever torn? As the candle flickered low, Elias resolved that his rebellion would persevere not through blind trust, but through the unbreakable conviction that grief should never be a prison. The city slept, but the threads of change were already weaving through its shadows, one clandestine stitch at a time. The city seemed different under the cloak of night, a murmur of shadows rather than the relentless clamor of day. Elias moved like a wraith through the narrow, twisting passages of Victorian London, his breath a visible wisp in the chilled air. The fog clung to the gaslit streets, blurring the edges of the world and offering him a rare kind of invisibility. Here, beneath the weight of stone and sorrow, he had shed the identity of a humble tailor and embraced something fiercer, the shadow tailor. Each step was measured, deliberate. The heavy grief garments that had once defined the mourners of London now whispered secrets to Elias' secrets. He was determined to unravel. His hands itched to work, to cut through the bindings of enforced sorrow that choked the city's heart. Tonight he was to meet Martha, his most trusted apprentice, and old Tom, the ragged informant who knew the city's undercurrents better than any official. They huddled beneath a flickering gas lamp, their faces half hidden in the mist, but alight with shared purpose. "The police grow restless," Martha whispered, her breath quick in the cold. "Graven's men are sniffing around more than ever." Elias nodded, eyes scanning the darkened street. "Then we must be swifter. Our work cannot falter now. People need us." His voice carried a quiet steel, forged in the fires of grief and rebellion. The workshop, tucked away in a forgotten cellar beneath an abandoned warehouse, was a sanctuary of shadows and whispered hope. Inside, the flickering candlelight danced across spools of black silk and threads of deepest charcoal. Elias set to work, fingers nimble despite the cold and fatigue. He carefully loosened the constricting seams of a mourning shawl, removing the stifling linings that pressed like a vice against the skin. Each stitch undone was a small act of defiance, a promise of relief for the bearer. Outside, the mourners' bells tolled, a melancholy dirge that echoed through the silent streets. The sound was a reminder of the city's unyielding grip on sorrow, and of the risks Elias took with every clandestine alteration. Yet as he worked, a swell of determination rose within him. This was no longer mere tailoring. It was revolution woven in fabric. Suddenly a harsh clang shattered the fragile calm. Lanterns bobbed into view as the morning police, led by the formidable Inspector Graven, stormed the workshop. Their uniforms, stiff and imposing, seemed to swallow the dim light, their faces masks of grim authority. "Search the premises," Graven barked. Chaos erupted. Elias grabbed the coded journal containing his methods, shoving it into the lining of his coat. Martha hurriedly concealed the tools beneath old scraps of grief cloth, while old Tom slipped through a hidden trapdoor, his patched coat blending with the darkness. The officers tore through the room, but Elias's quick thinking and intimate knowledge of the space allowed him to evade capture. Heart-pounding, he slipped out a back exit into the rain-slick alleyways, the cold biting through his threadbare coat. Breathless, he paused beneath a shadowed archway, listening to the fading footsteps of the raiding party. The city was still wrapped in sorrow, still shackled by its own customs, yet, in the soft stirrings of dawn, Elias glimpsed something new. Mourners passed by, their grief garments subtly altered by his handiwork. Lighter fabrics, less confining, allowing tears to fall without suffocation. A faint smile touched his lips. The shadow tailor would not be undone. His craft had become a beacon for those who dared to hope beyond the gilded cage of mourning. Though hunted, he was no longer alone. His rebellion was a stitch in the fraying fabric of Victorian society. And as the first pale light spilled over London's rooftops, Elias vanished into the labyrinth of streets, ready to weave the next chapter of defiance. Night cloaked London in its familiar shroud of mist and muted lamplight, a perfect veil for those who sought to move unseen. Elias felt the weight of the darkness settle around him like a second skin, offering protection and peril in equal measure. The transformation from day's tailor to night's outlaw was complete, and with it, a new purpose ignited within his weary soul. His shop, once a humble haven where grief was meticulously sewn into every seam, had become a crucible for revolution. The secret workshop beneath the city pulsed with quiet energy, a place where sorrow was not a prison but a fabric to be unraveled and rewoven. Martha's arrival was as silent as the falling fog. Her sharp eyes met his with a mixture of concern and resolve. "The police are tightening their noose," she murmured, glancing over her shoulder. "Graven himself has taken an interest." Elias's jaw tightened. Inspector Graven, with his imposing presence and unyielding dedication to the mourning laws, was the embodiment of the city's oppression. Every encounter with him edged closer to disaster. Yet fear was a luxury Elias could no longer afford. "Then we must be shadows sharper than their reach," Elias replied, unfolding a battered map speckled with marks denoting safe houses, contacts, and escape routes. "Our work must continue more covert, more precise." They bent over the map, plotting the next steps of their defiance. Each mark was a promise to a mourner burdened by the heavy, suffocating garments that society demanded they wear to display their sorrow. Elias's alterations, subtle loosenings, hidden linings, secret cuts offered relief, a whisper of freedom beneath the watchful eyes of the mourning police. Hours later, the room hummed with quiet activity. Elias moved with practiced grace, his fingers deftly loosening a collar that had strangled its wearer for weeks. The scent of damp wool mingled with the faint aroma of beeswax from the candle, creating an atmosphere thick with purpose. Suddenly, a sharp sound shattered the unmistakable clatter of boots on stone. Lanterns flickered through the doorway as Inspector Graven's men burst in, faces set like stone. The raid was swift and merciless. "Scatter," Elias hissed, grabbing his journal and darting toward the concealed exit. Martha and old Tom vanished into shadows, their muffled curses swallowed by the chaos. The mourners' garments, symbols of their grief and Elias's rebellion, lay scattered like fallen leaves. Out in the alley, rain slicked the cobblestones, glistening like scattered tears. Elias pressed his back against the cold brick, breath ragged but spirit unbroken. Somewhere in the distance, the bells tolled mournfully, a reminder of the city's unyielding sorrow. Yet amidst the darkness, a spark of hope flickered. The garments he had altered, worn by mourners now walking freer, lighter, beneath the watchful dawn, were a testament to the change he had begun. The Shadow Tailor was no longer just a man, he was a symbol. And symbols, once born, are hard to extinguish. Elias's nights became a dance of shadows and whispers. Each operation was a delicate balance of risk and reward, weaving through the city's veins like a secret thread. The mourners he helped carried his work silently, their eased burdens a subtle rebellion against the suffocating demands of Victorian grief. Yet with every daring act the noose tightened. Inspector Graven's patrols grew more frequent, more ruthless. The mourning police's lanterns probed the darkness, searching for the elusive tailor who dared to challenge their authority. But Elias was the night itself unseen, unheard, yet ever present. His resolve was a tapestry of sorrow and hope, stitched with the knowledge that true freedom lay beyond the heavy fabric of enforced mourning. And as London slept under its shroud of grief, the Shadow Tailor wove the first threads of a new dawn. The rain had begun as a mere sprinkle, a gentle pattering that blurred the gaslit streets of London into a shimmering haze. But as the mourning police closed in, their heavy boots echoing ominously against the cobblestones, the drizzle swelled into a relentless downpour. Elias's breath came in ragged gasps as hands gripped him roughly, dragging him through the slick streets. His threadbare coat, already soaked, clung to his frame, the cold seeping through every layer of fabric, biting at his skin. The faces of the officers were grim, their eyes unyielding, the weight of their duty pressing down like the very garments Elias sought to dismantle. He stumbled, the dampness making the cobbles treacherous beneath his worn boots. The city around him was a labyrinth of shadows and sorrow, the fog weaving through alleyways like a ghostly shroud. As they hauled him towards the station, Elias's mind raced, not with fear for himself alone, but for the countless souls shackled by the rigid expectations of mourning. His heart pounded not only from exertion, but from the looming question of what fate awaited him now. Days earlier he had not imagined that his quiet rebellion would lead him here. Yet the threads of his life were unraveling faster than he could stitch them back together. His secret workshop, hidden beneath the city's grime, had been compromised. Whispers of his illegal modifications had reached the ears of the mourning police, and the crackdown was swift and merciless. Inside the dim, cold cell, Elias sat on a rough bench, the damp stone walls closing in like the very grief garments he sought to remove. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant drip of water and the occasional murmur of footsteps. His fingers traced the worn seams of his coat, a tactile reminder of the life he was fighting to change. Then, unexpectedly, the heavy door creaked open. Captain Harrow appeared, his stern expression unyielding. Elias braced for the worst: trial, imprisonment, perhaps worse. But instead, a lady stepped through the doorway, her presence commanding and otherworldly in the austere chamber. Lady Agatha Whitmore, a figure whispered about in both high society and the shadowed alleys, regarded Elias with eyes that held a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "Release him," she commanded softly, yet with an authority that brooked no refusal. The captain hesitated but ultimately obeyed, unlocking the cell and stepping back. Elias rubbed his wrists, numb from confinement, as Lady Agatha led him through winding corridors to a carriage waiting outside. The journey to her estate was silent but charged with unspoken questions. As they entered her drawing room, lit by flickering candles that cast long shadows on the richly adorned walls, Elias took in the scene before him. Luxurious mourning garments hung on mannequins, each more ornate and elaborate than any he had dared to craft. Yet, beneath the finery, there was a palpable weight of heaviness that transcended fabric and thread. Lady Agatha's voice cut through his thoughts. "We are all prisoners of grief, Elias," she said quietly. "Whether wrapped in rags or velvet, the sorrow remains." Their conversation unfolded with delicate candor. She spoke of lost children, broken marriages, and the suffocating expectations of her class. Elias listened, the lines between them blurring. His rebellion was no longer against the garments alone, but against a society that demanded grief be worn as a spectacle, a cage gilded and ornate. As dawn crept over the London skyline, Elias stepped back into the mist-laden streets, the weight of new understanding settling upon him. He was free for now, but the path ahead was fraught with complexities he had yet to unravel. The gilded cage of sorrow encased all, and to dismantle it required more than skill with needle and thread. It demanded empathy, courage, and an unyielding resolve. The city stirred awake, unaware of the quiet revolution kindling in its heart. Elias melted into the fog, a shadow among shadows, carrying with him the fragile hope that grief might one day be felt, not worn.